Could you share with us what those three big ideas are?
Well, the first idea and the most central idea is you shouldn't focus on how many hours you work. You should focus on what you get accomplished.
Yeah, how do you not get nervous?
Well, first thing you got to do is figure out who your audience is and really understand what your audience wants to hear and what's the level of message they want. So first is figure out your audience. Second is have a limited number of messages. And third of all, repeat your messages, when you begin, the middle, and the end. You have to be honest and think about what you really want to do in your life and then try to aim for it. And don't give up easily, try to keep going.
In today's world of constant distractions, Bob Pozen, MIT professor, financial industry heavyweight, and author of Extreme Productivity, tackles the issue of staying productive. With the increasing need for high productivity, it's crucial to focus on key goals and cut through the noise. Join our conversation to learn practical tips for managing distractions and improving your work habits from Pozen's insights on how to make the most of your time and resources. Professor Pozen, such a pleasure to meet you again after more than a decade. I know you don't recall meeting me, but we met at this conference a long time ago, and it's really good to have you on today as my guest.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's been great reading your book, actually very timely for me. I mentioned to you, I do this podcast, but I also have a day job building an investment firm. So there are a lot of moving parts. And what inspired me the most reading this book is the genesis of you writing this book. And as I understand, you are teaching at MFS, which is Massachusetts Financial Services. We're not teaching. You were chairman at MFS, excuse me, and you're also simultaneously teaching at the Harvard Business School. And while you were at an airport, a professor approached you. And tell us what happened after that.
Well, it was the editor of the Harvard Business Review who approached me and said, you seem to have two jobs, executive chairman of MFS and full-time teacher at HBS. And yet you're the only person who submits his articles on time and within the word limit. So we'd like to know what your secret sauce is. So he interviewed me, and that interview ran in the Harvard Business Review, and it apparently went viral. And as a result, people started asking me to write a book on the subject.
That's a really cool story. And you talk about personal productivity and also the secret sauce. What was your personal realization that that you had this secret sauce and then you had to write this book?
Well, I started becoming productive when I was in high school. I came from a low-income family, so I had to work my way through high school and college. And so while I was in high school, I had two jobs, and I also played basketball and tennis and tried to have a social life. So I learned how to be productive just because I had to. Same thing in college. I was taking a pretty challenging course load at Harvard, and I was working a job, and so I had to learn how to balance all these things and get a lot done in a relatively short amount of time. So when this editor at Harvard Business Review approached me and said he wanted to do this interview, and he wanted to know what my secret sauce on productivity is. And when I saw how much people really wanted to hear that, that's what made me think of writing a book.
So you talk about growing up in with modest means in your book, and were you born at Bridgeport, Connecticut, or?
I was actually born in New York City, but we moved to Bridgeport when I was 3 years old.
Got it.
So I
So
spent most of my childhood in Bridgeport. And
got it.
Bridgeport, after World War II, most of the factories moved out, and it became a city that had lots of problems. And anybody who could tried to move to Fairfield or Westport or places like that. But my parents weren't able to do that, so that's where I went to school in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
I see. So maybe take us back to some early days where you're spending your time in elementary or primary school, and how you ended up at Harvard.
Well, when I was in high school, I took what was then called the PSATs, which are the preliminary SATs, and I got some very high scores. And so University of Pittsburgh, among others, offered me the chance to come to do a summer program there. And that's what I did. I did a summer program at the University of Pittsburgh. I took two college courses, one in political science and the other one in psychology. And the political science course was taught by a Harvard alumni named Bryce Nelson. And he was the one who encouraged me to apply to Harvard. I did very well in that course, and he said, "You really should be at Harvard." And he knew a little the admissions director, and he said, under the new admissions policy, they're looking for students from places like Bridgeport. So they were trying to diversify their student body. At that time, about half the school came from prep schools.
That's very impressive. Sorry, were your parents proud of you that you got into Harvard?
Well, actually, I got into other places that offered me a full ride. And so Harvard offered me a scholarship, and it really wasn't enough because during the time that my application was pending, my father lost his job. And so I wrote Harvard and said that I couldn't come on the scholarship they gave me, and they were very kind. And they increased the scholarship and gave me a job called the work-study program. And so that's how I was able to get there financially. But for my family, it was difficult. They probably would have preferred for me to go someplace where I had a full ride, as opposed to having to cobble together scholarships and loans.
And then after Harvard, did you decide to just go to law school straight away, or did you have some work experience?
After I graduated from Harvard, I won a traveling fellowship, which is sort of like an academic prize. There are 3 traveling fellowships, Knox, Sheldon, and Shaw. I think there are a total of 6 or 8 fellowships. And I won one of those, and that gives you a certain amount of money and allows you to travel all around the world. So turns out that most of the people who got these fellowships went to Oxford or Cambridge or London School of Economics or went to Europe. But I decided that I wanted to see the world, so I went to Africa and the Middle East and spent a whole year traveling around.
That's so cool. I love traveling too. Where did you go in Africa and the Middle East?
Well, in Africa, I started, at that time, there was a Pan Am flight that started in Dakar and stopped at every single major capital, all the way down to Joburg. So that's what I took. And I wound up staying at the University of Ghana, where some lecturer who was supposed to come from England didn't show up. So they asked me if I would teach a course there on urban studies. And so that's what I did. I stayed in Ghana for 4 or 5 months and started some research, which I later came back to finish.
That's really cool. And did you study for your LSAT while you were in Africa?
I really didn't. I have to tell you, I really didn't study for my LSAT.
So how did you pass it? What was the secret?
I don't know. I was always a good test taker, so I don't know. I can't really tell you the answer to that question. But we didn't, at that time, I don't know, people just took the test. They didn't have, there was, I mean, maybe there were preparation courses, but I didn't take one. I took out a book from the library that was sort of told you a little about the test and how it was structured. And I read that book, but I never really spent much time preparing.
That's very impressive. In your book, you talk about caring about the civil rights movement, and at the time when you were applying for law school, the Vietnam War was going on, if I'm correct, and you wanted to have some influence in those two regards. What kind of impact do you think you had when you chose to go to law school, or what kind of involvement would you say you had in those regards?
Well, I was involved with quite a few protests at Yale, which is where I went to law school, and we had civil rights protests. And at Harvard, at our commencement, we invited Martin Luther King's widow, Cora King, to speak, because the Harvard commencement invited the Shah of Iran, and we didn't think that was a very good choice. So we invited her and had an alternative commencement. But when I got to Yale, there was the Bobby Seale trial was going on in New Haven. And so we protested that. And then the Vietnam War, there were lots of protests. I don't know how much impact all these protests had, but during law school, in the 2 summers of law school after my first and second year, I worked with Ralph Nader and co-authored a book on the DuPonts in Delaware. So that probably had more effect than my protesting as part of a larger protest group.
Got it. I digress a little, but you mentioned Ralph Nader. I heard that he played a key role in that seatbelt law that we all have now, where if you don't put your seatbelt on, you hear that. Is that true? You hear that beep?
That's true. He was the one who really pushed for that. And then he started a Center for Auto Safety, and then he expanded beyond that to other sorts of, I guess you would call it, muckraking. And he hired a team to go to Delaware to see whether DuPonts were exercising their corporate responsibility. And that's what the book we wrote in, the DuPonts in Delaware.
Interesting.
It was published. It was published as it was about 300 or 400 pages long.
Yeah, for viewers that don't know who Ralph Nader is he was presidential candidate, I think, in the 90s, and he ran from an independent party. Was it called the Green Party?
Oh, he ran in year 2000.
Oh, okay, right, okay. So 2000. Got it.
Some people say because of him, Al Gore lost the election because some people voted for Ralph Nader instead of Al Gore. And of course, the election was very close, and especially in Florida. So a few thousand votes one way or another could have made a big difference.
I remember that. So want to just fast forward to after you finish law school, did you want to practice law, or what did you do after you graduated from Yale?
I wasn't interested in going to a corporate law firm because I was you know, not ideologically compatible with going for a corporate law firm. And I also didn't like the lifestyle of a corporate law firm. I was much more intellectually oriented. And I started a project on law and economics. And so I stayed on an extra year at Yale Law School. And I went back to Africa and I finished the research that I was doing in Ghana. And I wrote a book on state enterprises in Africa. And I helped teach some courses at Yale Law School, and I really liked it. So I decided to go into teaching. But everyone told me I should practice first, but I wasn't that interested in doing that.
Got it. So you taught at NYU and then Georgetown as well, and then somehow you ended up at the SEC.
Well, actually, I was a visiting professor at Georgetown for a year, and then I got a regular appointment at NYU Law School. And that's where I focused on law and economics and law and finance. And I wrote quite a few articles using law and economics as a framework to deal with big issues. And for instance, pension law, ERISA, was just passed in 1974. And it had concepts like prudent person rule. And I helped write the regulations trying to give some economic content to that. I also wrote a textbook called Regulation of Financial Institutions, which dealt with mutual funds and banks, pension funds, and insurance companies. And I think it was that textbook that caught the eye of the SEC, and they decided that they wanted to broaden out their staff, and they asked me to come down to Washington to become Associate General Counsel. So that's what I did. Before, the SEC's General Counsel Office was mainly a litigation unit, but they decided they wanted to get involved with rulemaking, legislation, much broader concepts. And that's where I was brought in to head up the unit that did non-litigation.
Got it. And then you had you call it your big break in your career. You get a job at Fidelity. How did that happen?
Well, there was a headhunter that was hired by Fidelity when it was a small company. And at that time, it was very much New England based. But Ned Johnson, who was the chairman, wanted to expand the base and wanted to become a national company. So he went out looking for people who could help bring the company to a new level. And that person came to Washington, and the headhunter met me and offered me a job as general counsel of Fidelity. And I went up to Boston and I interviewed for the job. And I interviewed a lot of people, and finally I got to Ned Johnson, and I said to him, nobody's given me a job description yet. Could you give me a job description? And he said, yeah, here's your job description. Figure out what needs to be done and do it. So that had a lot of appeal to me. So yeah, I took the job, and I worked my way up on the ladder in Fidelity, and it was a very successful company, and I had a very good career there.
Professor, you had such an illustrious and successful career. We can go on and on and on and on talking about all the different great things that you have accomplished, but we have to talk about this book, Extreme Productivity, that you wrote in 2011, I believe, is when you finished it.
Yeah, I think it was published in 2012.
2012, boost your results, reduce your hours. I want to focus on this book for the next whatever time we have left. I read it. I told you earlier, it was very timely for me. I needed to get organized myself. Sometimes I get very anxious, just not sure which things to prioritize. But this book definitely helped me, and I want to go through it with you here. The book is mainly composed of 5 different parts that you broke it into. and each part has 2 to 3 chapters. In the very first part, you start with the 3 big ideas, which then sets the tone for the rest of the book. Could you share with us what those 3 big ideas are?
Well, the first idea and the most central idea is you shouldn't focus on how many hours you work. You should focus on what you get accomplished. Because in the world that we live in a knowledge-based economy, it doesn't matter how many hours you work. It's what you get accomplished. If you're a journalist and you spend a month on an article and you produce it and it's not very good, you're not congratulated because you spent a lot of time. Similarly, if you spend 3 hours on something and you write a great article, nobody says, well, it's too bad you didn't spend enough time on it. So it's your results that's important, not the number of hours. It's
Right.
it's the output, not the input. So then the 3 ideas that follow from that are, first of all, how do you know which activities you ought to pursue? How do you know which accomplishments, which results are the most important? Well, the only way you can do that is by articulating your goals and prioritizing them. So that's the first main idea. Then the second idea is to start at the end. And by that, I mean, try to figure out where you want to go. What's the final product going to look like? And try to, after the first few days of research, try to write a preliminary conclusions about where you're going. And that will guide you in your research and help you come to grips early with the critical problems. And then the third thing is don't sweat the small stuff, which means try to, hop over all the small stuff that's not really that important and focus on the most important things. So those are the 3 main ideas that they all grow out of the idea of concentrate on your accomplishments, your output, not your input.
Correct. So one of the interesting things I thought about reading the first part of setting your prioritization and goals, and not focusing on the number of hours input, rather focus on the output, which is essentially what productivity is. It still seems that in the knowledge economy that a lot of lawyers, for example, are still using hourly methodologies in quantifying, how much work they're getting done, or just, hourly employees per hour, what they're getting done. Isn't that kind of unproductive to still have
Yeah,
that?
I think it's very counterproductive because if you're paying somebody like a lawyer by the hour, they spend a lot of hours on it, then they get paid more, even though they might be doing a very second-rate job. So we find more and more lawyers are working on project basis. They get a certain amount of money for doing a project, and then it's up to them to do it in the more efficient way. So that's a better way to do it. Probably, the question is, are hours a good proxy for productivity? And probably the only place they are is on the assembly line, but where you have a pretty structured process. But that's from the industrial age, and most workers are no longer working on assembly lines. So I think it's very counterproductive to be paid on hours.
So, you work in the financial services industry. I come from the finance background as well. I own an investment firm. We're known to work really, really long hours, right? So I'm just curious if you were to give me some advice as far as how to set some standards at my company for associates, analysts that are working hard in terms of their productivity. In terms of them,
The key is to agree with your boss on what are the things that your boss wants done this week, and then be freed up to accomplish those goals whenever and wherever you want. So it's not a question of your being in the office from 8 in the morning till, say, 10 p.m. at night. It's a question of how, that's not the metric. The metric is, have you achieved the goals that were set for you? So that's really what's important. There have been
It's communicating that to the team.
there have been news stories about people in investment banks that work all night. Well, that's not, usually they're not very productive when they're working all night.
Right. Great. I want to move on to the different parts of the book. So we covered the 3 ideas: set and prioritize your goals, focus on the final product, don't sweat the small stuff. And you have an acronym there called Ohio. Maybe we can talk about that in the next segments. What Ohio means. It's kind of funny.
We could talk about it now.
Sure, let's talk about it.
Okay, Ohio means only handle it once, and it's a way to sort of deal with the small stuff. It's don't when you get something that's important, make sure that you get to it right away and get it done. If you put it off and wait a week, there are only 2 possibilities. One is that you forget about it, and then you lose total grasp of it, and that's no good. The other is that you remember it, and then you spend another half an hour trying to figure out where it was and what it said. So only handle it once is a really good way of approaching these things.
Got it. In terms of implementing those 3 big ideas, you suggest that you need to focus on productivity every day. How do you define productivity every day?
Well, the question is, how do you have these goals that you set up, which are yearly goals? That's where I think you ought to start, with yearly goals. And then you translate them into weekly goals. And then each night before you go to work, you ought to write for the next day. What do you really want to get accomplished? What are the things that really need to be accomplished? And what are the things that are nice to have? And then I like to see what I call a 2-sided schedule, where on the one side you have your appointments and schedules, but on the other side you write, what do you hope to get out of this phone call or meeting? And that should be related to your goals. So the 2-sided schedule is a way to integrate your goals into your daily schedule by focusing each activity on how does further your goals. And if it doesn't further your goals, maybe you ought not to be doing it.
Makes sense. On the 3rd part, you talk about developing personal skills, which makes sense. Like I'm working every day on my day job, but here I am talking to you on a podcast. It made me read this book and do some personal development activity here. So you talk about developing personal skills in your book too. Why is it so important to be productive?
Well, some of the most important skills are your own personal skills. So let's take reading efficiently and reading effectively. Well, that's how you absorb information. And so if you can learn to do that effectively and efficiently, it will make you much more productive. But again, that goes back to goals. I recommend that before you start reading something, and we're not talking about novels, we're talking about reading something for a business purpose or professional purpose, you ought to think about, what's your actual goal in reading this? What are you trying to get out of it?
The output. Again, the output.
And then reading for those messages. So sometimes people say you should read very quickly, and that will help you be more efficient by reading lots of words very quickly. But my view is the opposite. My view is you want to read fewer words, but want to read the right words. So you start by reading the introduction, and then you read the conclusion, and then you can figure out what's really important for you. And then you read the rest of the article or the book by focusing on what's important to you and what you want to get out of this. So that's the key to reading. With the writing, my basic take on writing is two different processes. One is a logical thinking process of figuring out a line of argument, and the other is a translation process by which you're translating what you want to say in a way that the other person can understand and intelligently absorb it. And lots of people try to do both at the same time. And to me, that leads to a lot of confusion. So I like to recommend that people do an outline at the beginning, and that gives them a chance to establish the logical line of argument. And then once they start writing, they can focus on the translation piece because they've already figured out their line of argument. So that's my main take on writing. Figure out what your logic is, what your line of argument is, where you want that writing to go, and then use the time in writing, in actual writing, to translate and focus on communication skills and communicating your message to the reader.
Got it. You also talk about speaking effectively, which, I want to take extra notes because, when I get in front of a camera, sometimes I get nervous and can't articulate as well as I usually do when I'm not in front of a camera. How do you not get nervous?
Well, first thing you got to do is figure out who your audience is and really understand what your audience wants to hear and what's the level of message they want. Then the second thing you need to do is put together a small series of messages that you want to get across. Usually I say, try to limit that to 3 points that you want to really get across. And then the third thing is to start the introduction, tell the people that you're going to do these 3 points, then do the 3 points, and then at the end come back and conclude, emphasizing these 3 points over and over again. So first is figure out your audience. Second is have a limited number of messages. And third of all, repeat your messages, when you begin, the middle, and the end, so that you're driving it home. Listening to a talk is very different than reading it. People have a much more difficulty absorbing the information. That's why you've got to repeat it. I want to go back and make sure that we cover efficient meetings, because meetings are the bane of our existence, and that's where a lot of people lose a lot in productivity. So I have a series of best practices before, during, and at the end of the meeting, and those are the ones that I emphasize. Before the meeting, you should try to invite as few people as possible, that only the people are needed to know. People often invite so many people to the meeting that it gets too big. Usually a meeting that goes beyond 6 or 8 people starts to become unwieldy, and you can't really get the sort of discussion that you need. You also need to hand out in advance the materials for the meeting, including an agenda, so that people can actually know what the meeting's about. And then if the agenda doesn't fit their goals or purpose, they really ought not to go there. So those are some of the things that you need to do before the meeting. during the meeting, it's important not to have PowerPoint that lasts for 45 minutes or an hour, because lots of times the leader just goes through one PowerPoint after another and people's eyes start to glaze over and they really don't know why they're there. The leader should start and not spend more than 10 minutes just teeing up. Why are we here? What are the issues we want to discuss? What do we hope to get out of this meeting? Then the meeting should proceed, and most of the meetings should occur in the discussion mode, where people are discussing back and forth what they do and what they think, or decision-making mode, if that's what the meeting's about, and really working through the decision-making. And then at the end, you got to have good closure for a meeting. You got to make sure that people know what's been decided and what are the next steps. Often people come out of the meeting and they don't know what's been decided. Everything's up in the air. So you need to be explicit about what's been decided, and then what are the next steps? Who has the responsibility for the next steps, and what is the time frame? And finally, I would say about meetings, no meetings should occur more than 1 hour and less if possible, especially online meetings. They shouldn't go more than 45 minutes because people start to lose attention. Sometimes you can have an in-person meeting that goes as long as 90 minutes, but that's the maximum. So you got to make sure your meetings are short and sweet.
Very good advice. I recommend viewers to watch your lectures on YouTube that you gave at MIT. You do have presentations on the screen, but the way you engage them is a really great way to learn, the engagement techniques.
I'm not sure those lectures might have been at HBS rather than MIT.
You have one from MIT also, or two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But want to talk about the other part where you talk about managing up and down. This is the chapter is more designed for somebody working in a big organization, but I would say it applies to any organization. It does it. You can be an entrepreneur and still have stakeholders where you have responsibilities to answer to them to a certain extent. How do you view managing up and down in any organization?
Well, those chapters are geared to anybody who's managing a team in a team context. It doesn't have to be a big, large organization. So if you're managing a team, the most important thing to do is to delegate. Most people who manage teams have a hard time giving up control. They want to keep control and they have a hard time delegating. And so I'd like to sort of force people who are managing teams to actually go through and say, what's a fairly low value added activity that they're engaged in that they could have somebody else do? So if you really press people, you can find that there are a number of things they could be delegating that they're not. Managing up has to do with managing your boss. People sometimes don't think of managing their boss, but really it's an important function. Managing your boss is probably, you don't have to love your boss, you don't even have to like your boss, but you have to manage him or her. And that means making sure that you get the goals set out. Otherwise, you're just going to be working at hours and hours. You want to make sure that your manager tells you what are the things you need to get accomplished within the next week or next month. And that allows you the freedom and the flexibility to get them done in the way that you think is best. And then you have to make sure that your boss gives you a performance review so you get feedback. There are lots of people who are bosses that don't give people performance review, so they have no idea of how they're actually doing. So those are some of the key points that are made in that chapter.
I want to ask you to take us to maybe a scenario in your own personal, in your own professional experience where you had to delegate and there was a need to delegate because you're having some challenges with getting your goals accomplished. Could you give us an example or so about that kind of a situation?
Yeah, well, when I was president of Fidelity Management and Research Co., so that's the whole investment arm. So there are lots of, it's a very large organization, and we wanted to make sure that people felt the responsibility of what I call own your own space. We wanted each of the people in the group to think of themselves as running their own business. And the way to do that is to divide the group into smaller groups so that there was a small cap group and a large cap growth group and a large cap value group. So then the question is how you delegate to that. And so I had a number of lieutenants and gave them the responsibilities of running those groups. And I would come and meet with those groups once a quarter. But I was able to delegate a lot of the responsibility to these lieutenants. Otherwise, I couldn't have existed. I couldn't have run an organization. I mean, when I started as president of Fidelity, when I became president, we were managing about 500 billion. And when I stepped down, we were managing about $1 trillion. So you can't manage that sort of money yourself. You got to make sure that other people do it. So we did a delegation system combined with a very intensive performance attribution system. So that's what I did when I came every quarter. I looked at the performance attribution system and I could tell not just what the performance was, but how it was achieved. And then I could get a sense of what was happening. But there's always the natural impulse to take control of all these things. But if you try to take control of everything when you're the boss, pretty soon that's all you'll be doing. You gotta learn to focus on what are the most important functions for you to do as a boss. What are the things that you and only you can do as a boss? That's the important question, not whether or not you're the best at this, because you might be the best at doing a number of things. That doesn't mean it's a good idea for you to do it. It might be worth delegating because they're low value.
Interesting. So you talk about owning your space, accurate metrics, no micromanaging. And then you also mentioned fostering trust. And we all know how important that is in any situation when you're dealing with people. You know, can you give us an example of how you foster trust with your team?
I think the most important thing about trust is to be genuine and to get a sense of genuine, that you care about these people, not just as professionals, not just as doing the work. You care about what happens to them, what happens to their families. That's one way you generate trust. Another is to be absolutely honest with them. If they're doing something great, tell them it's great. If they're doing something problematic, nicely discuss it with them. They want to hear the truth. And that's they'll trust it. They don't want the sense that something's going wrong, but you're not going to tell them.
So there's another sensitive topic which you touched upon is managing your boss. Sometimes you can't control the fact who your boss is, right? I mean, are there any situations that you can point to where there was a disgruntled boss and an employee kind of had to handle that misfortune and came out on the other side and successfully?
Well, there are lots of situations where there are dysfunctional bosses. So if you're in a situation like that, you've got to establish goals and success metrics And if your boss won't give them to you, then you've got to create them. And I've seen people write memos to the boss saying, this is what I understand I'm supposed to be doing this week and this month. And here are the success metrics. So that's one way in which you can manage your boss. If he or she won't give you the goals and success metrics, you give them to your goal, give them to your boss, and ask them to object if they disagree with them.
Got it. And we are on the fifth a part of the book, which is pursuing a productive life. Talk about outlining career planning, but you also mention how you can plan all you want, but sometimes you just have to look at it from a short-term perspective. How did you maximize your career options over your life?
Let me just state what my theory of career planning is. You can't control what's going to happen 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. Because the world is going to change. Just think about how much the world changed from 1995 to 2010 in those 15 years. So if you tried to plan out what was going to happen, you would never be right. The other thing is that you change. You might get married, you might have children, you might get divorced, you might move to a different city. So both the world's going to change and you're change. So the question is, since you can't control a lot of that, what can you do? And the answer is you can maximize your probability. You can maximize your options. So you don't know what's going to be available in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But if you have a wide variety of options, the wider variety you have, the better. So for example, if you were managing traders on a trading desk and you had the chance to become a higher paid trader, but you still be trading versus you're managing a desk at the same or even lower pay, you'd be best off managing the trading desk, because then in 5 or 10 years, you would have both the experience as a trader and the experience in managing a trading desk. But if all you did was trading and you never managed a trading desk, then you wouldn't have any experience in management. And when that option became available, you wouldn't qualify. So that's what I mean by maximizing the number of options that are available to you.
Got it. And you also emphasize on prioritizing home life, personal life. What's it been for you on that front?
Well, even when I was president of Fidelity, I got home every night for dinner at 7:00 and had dinner with my children and my wife. And then I would spend some quality time with them. Yes, I would go back to work and talk to the Far East around 10 p.m. at night, but still, that was the key, to have that quality time. And this brings us back to where we started in terms of goals and success metrics and prioritization. If you can set goals and success metrics on accomplishment, then that frees you up to get them done whenever and wherever you want. It doesn't require that you be in the office a particular set of hours, because the objective isn't to put in the hours. The objective is to get the goals accomplished. So setting goals and articulating success metrics not only is good for productivity, but it's good for work-life balance, because it gives you flexibility to do things. People aren't really that concerned about working hard, I find, but they want the flexibility to work the hours and in the places they want. So that's the key to work-life balance, flexibility as to hours and place.
So that's great advice. If I missed out any other very important part that you think you want to mention from the book, what would it be? What are some of the takeaways?
I just want to mention that in the last year, I've had a team that's worked with me in putting together AI tools for each chapter. And you can find them at bobposen.com. So you can go there, and if you
Put the link up
register,
here. Mhm.
then each of these chapters has AI tools that go along with it.
Very cool. We'll do that. And I always have a section for, life, values, community. You already talked about how important family life is to you. I wanted to ask you, what is the greatest pleasure of your personal life?
What's the greatest pleasure of my personal life is to have a chance to have a quiet evening with my son or daughter and my wife, and we as a family have a family discussion or enjoy something together. When my son and his family were here this summer, we all every night watched the Olympics together. And that was a wonderful feeling that we as a group were shouting and cheering for the USA. But it was a real sense of community, strong sense of community.
That's awesome. And finally, for our viewers, a lot of them are students, young professionals, investors. If you could share with them one life lesson, what would it be?
That's a very difficult question on one life lessons. I think the lesson that I would share is that you have to be true to yourself. You have to be honest and think about what you really want to do in your life, and then try to aim for it. And don't give up easily. Try to keep going and keep going. But first, you got to figure out what you really want. And a lot of people have a hard time doing that. But once they figure out what they want, then they can take some risks, especially if they're young, and see if they can achieve it.
Professor Posen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and also subscribe to the channel. And also below, you can comment. You can tell me what I can do to improve the content so I can continue to produce better content for you all. Thank you again for your participation. We really appreciate you.